Look, if you can get past all the drug-addled redneck neighbors, vandalizations, car thefts, break-ins, sexual assaults, and occasional stabbings, this town isn't so bad.
Hello, you are listening to NPE Stories. This is a podcast where NPEs can share their story. I am your host, Lily, and I found out I was an NPE through an ancestry DNA test that changed my life forever. NPE is a term that stands for Not Parent Expected or Non-Paternal Event. This means that one or more of our parents are not who we believe them to be. NPE Stories is a podcast where NPEs can share their story of what their original family was like, how they found out they were an NPE, and what their journey has been like since the day they found out. Welcome to episode 186. And I just bought my ticket for the Untangling Our Roots Summit. It will be held in April 2024. I believe the dates are April 25th through the 28th. It will be in Denver, Colorado, and this will be a chance for NPEs, adoptees, and donor-conceived individuals to unite. There will be entertainment and facilitators and workshops and meals, and I went last year, and it was a wonderful time. It was my first time being around, I think it was about 300 people last year. And all of us were quickly nodding along with each other. It just felt so great to go. I would suggest you check out the website. I will put it down below. And this is for the Untangling Our Roots Summit held in April 2024. And today we are going to listen to an NPE share his story. And today I'm speaking with Bob. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Lily. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for setting the time aside to do this today.
Of course. My pleasure. Thank you. As I said up front, longtime listener, first-time caller. And thank you to you, of course. I want to establish that for everything you've done for that community. You've brought a lot of catharsis to people. And as I mentioned, I think you might have the most empathetic voice of anyone I've ever heard. So hats off for all that you do.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Okay, so I briefly looked at your email, but I didn't want to get too much of your backstory because I just wanted to hear it from you directly. Let's go ahead and get into who was in your family of origin and a little bit about what your childhood was like.
Sure. Well, I feel like there are two kind of foundational things to start with before I even maybe talk about my family. And the first one is really, because I think it'll play out that it's important. It's a little bit about my mom's upbringing. So, what I found, Lily, is probably unlike a lot of the folks I've heard on your show and from what I've read. I don't really have a mom issue. My mom was a lovely, lovely human being, probably one of the kindest and best-hearted souls that I've ever known. And she's since passed away. We'll talk a little bit about that. But she had a really kind of rough bringing. She grew up in Detroit. Her mom was sick and then died when she was a kid. And her dad, it was the Depression. Her dad was out of work and he was a drinker, all the terrible stuff. And despite all that stuff, she was just this light kind of just, again, very warm-hearted soul. And, it was palpable. So, people really responded to her. Mm-hmm. But she, look, given that background, she was very resilient. She just was kind of a survivor and was a kind soul. So, that was certainly part of it. So that I think fed into her, perhaps, led to my eventual conception. But So that's one background. And then the other thing I think is good as a foundational point is, and I'm going to read this to you. It's just a sentence, but it's telling. And I'll give you this to ask up front. I think in all of the episodes I've listened to from you, they're pretty much PG rated. They're not R rated, right? So, this may be a little crass, or maybe PG-13 for the show, but I won't call the town out by name, but it's the town that I grew up in. And I grew up around the Detroit area in a suburb just outside of the city, probably about 5 miles from the dividing line, which is 8 Mile. Some people have heard of the Eminem movie, 8 Mile.
Oh, yeah.
So I grew up in 13 Mile, which isn't far from there. It's not a lot better. But this is the way they described the town that I grew up on. There was a list one time that talked about all the different suburbs around Detroit, and I always got a kick out of it. And this is how they described the town that I grew up in. And again, I'll unbrand it and call it City X. How's that? Basically said, look, if you can get past all the drug-addled redneck neighbors, vandalizations, car thefts, break-ins, sexual assaults, and occasional stabbings, this town isn't so bad. So that'll give you a soundbite of where I came from. And again, the upbringing was fine. I mean, it was a little, the area wasn't the greatest, but we lived in a nicer part of that area. And my parents were older when I was born. They had moved out of the city of Detroit in 1964. I was born in 68. But, that was a city that had a lot of tensions and, racial tensions and things like that. So there was a lot of turmoil in and around that town. And I'm not 100% sure, but I've always wondered, given when I was born, which is in 1968, in the months, if I wasn't conceived during the Detroit riots, which were, I think to this day, still some of the biggest riots that the country's ever seen. And the timing works out. So it always made me wonder if somebody was in lockdown, when I was conceived. But at any rate, that's a little glimpse of the town. My parents were older when they had me. My dad was 38. My mom was 37. And in the late 60s, that wasn't typical, They had my older sister, who was 13 years older than I was. And they also had a child that they lost in 1960. So in between my sister being born in 55 and me being born in 68, they also would have had an older sister, a middle child sister, who didn't last more than a few days. And I do think, again, as resilient as my parents were and my mom was, I think that any parent would experience, right? I mean, that kind of hung over her a little bit. Mm-hmm. So that's, my family structure. My older sister was never anything like me. I'm sure you've heard this story a million times at this point. God bless her, but we were nothing alike. She was out of the house by the time I was probably 5. She got married, I think, when I was 6, and is still married, but looked a little bit alike, but we just couldn't have been more vastly different. And, that is probably many people have said about this experience. There was never any one clue, but there were a million small clues. So, but that was my mom and my sister. My dad was a good guy. I mean, neither of my folks were educated. Nobody went to college. I was the first person in my family to do that, or at least in my family I grew up in. So I was kind of like a little bit of an oddball, right? I mean, I was a good student. My mom was smart and my sister was smart. My dad was very street smart, but I really was. I think my dad often looked at me like, he used to joke. He's like, you must get your smarts from your mom, because he was a terrible student. And, he was a really funny guy and he was a really good looking guy. But I never looked anything like him. He was tall and had this beautiful, lustrous hair. He was probably 6'3" and rail thin in his youth, where I was stocky. And my hair started receding when I was like 15. So, and his joke always used to be, he had no chest hair. He'd tell me, well, I think it's all popping out before it gets to your head, and that's why you're thinning on top, because it's sprouting out of your chest. So, he was kind of a wise ass in a very kind of funny and lovable way. My sister, as I referenced, was out of the house by the time I was 5. And, my sister, like I said, she's vastly different. Like she wasn't as attuned to things as I was. She, I don't think she had any sense of any issues between my parents. And, look, I was my first recollection of my parents having any tension was I was probably under the age of 10, maybe somewhere in there. And, look, they had some ups and downs, and I could see that. But, they stayed together. And, the solace that I take is for instance, I was with my dad passed first, probably 2, I don't know, gosh, he died in 01 and my mom died in 04. So under 3 years apart. But I remember spending the night with my mom when he passed. And, I could see the grief, right? I mean, they loved each other. And I'll never really know, I'll fill you in on how my biological father plays into this. But, they had some bumps along the way. Now, I was born in 1967, which if you're a music fan or any fan, you'll know was the summer of love, right? So, who knows what was going on in the 60s, right? But my mom ran a little savings and loan, and she worked there for over 40 years. And it was like It's a Wonderful Life. She knew everybody by name. There was no security guards. There was no bars. It was very, very simple. No computers. And the person who started that savings and loan was my biological father. So he, so I know your mind goes to potentially the worst places, right? When you make this discovery. And I have the assurance in my heart of hearts that, it wasn't anything hinky. It wasn't an assault. It wasn't, they were friends. She had the utmost respect for him, and he really gave her a chance for, somebody who really had no formal education other than high school. She was just good with numbers and she was good with people. And, she sat at the front of that little savings and loan for decades and just kept customers happy. It was, she just had that great touch, and she was very human and would listen to their problems, and they'd sit down at her desk and, but my biological father, started that savings and loan. And I think his father, who would have been my grandfather, was running it initially. He died. And I think that's when my mom, moved up from teller to running it. And again, wasn't any place fancy. It was a little bit of a dump, but she always ran it very profitably. And, the biological father, and I know we're going to transition to that, he was, and I'd met him numerous times because as I worked at that savings and loan as a teller, and they wanted me to take over for her at one point, which I did go work there for a year after I'd started my career and helped them go through a stock conversion, but I didn't want to sit in the same spot for 40 years. But my biological father was an incredibly successful and wealthy man. He had multiple ventures. He was an attorney and a pilot. He was a major real estate developer in Michigan and around the country. He's in the Hall of Fame and the Detroit Builders, whatever Hall of Fames they have for, every industry has its Hall of Fame. But again, I spent time with the guy, and I thought he had a gentle presence about himself. Like there wasn't a lot of hubris. He wasn't, he was very well dressed. He drove a Mercedes, which I never saw on that side of town. We were right on the outskirts of Detroit where that place was. And he didn't come very often. He came about once a month, maybe for a board meeting. But interestingly, my mom arranged for a breakfast meeting for the two of us, he and I, because they did want me to take over for her. I don't know if he did or if she pushed for that. Career in advertising, I'd spent a year and a half in an ad agency, and it's a grind. It's 80-hour weeks. And knew I wanted to go back to graduate school, and I thought maybe I could go work there and help them do this stock conversion. And either I'll stay and go to school at night, or I'll help them with what they need done, and I'll parachute out. And at any rate, he had a breakfast meeting with me, which I thought was odd because he knew me a little bit because I was a teller. And I'd probably met him 5, 6, 8 times. And we had a breakfast meeting at the toniest restaurant in the toniest suburb of Detroit, which was his, they were on the other side of town. We were where the bank was, and where I lived was on the other side of the tracks, as they say. Detroit is very divided between East Side and West Side. But at any rate, we had a breakfast meeting that I still remember to this day. And I remember leaving that meeting, Lily, thinking, God, that seemed like more than an interview, right? It didn't feel like just an interview. Anyway, it's just kind of funny to look back at that. And I do remember, I remember a joke I made at the table that made him laugh. So, some of that conversation is certainly left upon my mind. So I ended up working there. And then ironically, he served as a reference for me when I did go back to graduate school. And, I wrote the letter and he signed it, and he was a reference. The only odd thing I'd say was I remember my mom every once in a while would say, oh, Mr. I won't call him by name, but Mr. J, that is what she called him, which was the initial. She said, Mr. J, wanted to know how number one son's doing today. He asked about you. And I always thought, well, that's very nice, but kind of, okay, that's very sweet of him to want to know how I'm doing. But,
So did Mr. J know you were his biological son?
Well, that is an excellent question. And, certainly one of the first ones that I'm asked. Well, usually the first question people ask is, do you think your dad knew? Right.
Right.
Which, answer that next. I've since seen pictures. So, I might be jumping ahead in your usual sequence, but, I knew my newfound brother because, so I had 3 new siblings that I did not know, that I came to know about. And I knew of all 3 of them because of my mom's very tight relationship with that family. I only really knew, and I use that term loosely, the one brother. And the only reason I knew him is because Mr. J had brought his son in to be the president of the Savings and Loan And, he was a bright guy and, but kind of didn't have a great relationship with his father, as I've come to find out. He was in the mix. So he was at my wedding. And then it's a long story that I'll spare you, but living upstate New York, and when we moved here, my mom was alive and she was supposed to come out to watch the kids because the movers were shipping all her stuff from the Detroit area. And my mom died. So she had a heart attack. I had to fly back to Detroit while the moving truck was coming this way.
Oh.
But, so that was kind of a bummer. My daughter was like 9 months old. I mean, it was terrible.
Oh.
It was as bad. My son was, I think, 3. My daughter was 9 months. And, well, maybe by then. My daughter was born in January of that year, and my mom died in December, just before Christmas. So I had to leave my wife, my poor wife, as we moved into a new house. With the movers coming, I had to leave her with a 3-year-old and a baby. It's like, hey, sorry, got to go.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom lived for a few days, but she passed. She had a heart attack. So we had the funeral there in the Detroit area. And I didn't know it at the time, but my brother, who, again, had been to my wedding and who was a part of that savings and loan, and his sister, my half-sister, came to the funeral. And I do remember, I mean, my head literally was in a million places, as you might imagine. Brand new job, started moving my family, and my mom dies in the middle, but while our furniture is getting shipped out here. So anyway, so my head was in a million places, and I don't remember a lot from her funeral. I mean, I did the eulogy and, I was greeting everybody because my sister's that's not her thing. Anyway, but the only conversation that I remember from that funeral was with that new half sister. It was just funny that it's like we honed in and we just locked in somehow. It was a little bizarre. I mean, at the time it didn't strike me other than, it was a nice conversation. At any rate, it's just kind of funny in retrospect because you're like, well, did we, why did we lock in?
Yeah.
It could be coincidental. My sister that I grew up with, again, we were never anything alike. And, we always used to joke, I don't mean to make light of this, but that my sister was a little kooky. So my dad's mom, my grandma that I grew up with, was a little kooky. She was supposedly born on the boat over from Italy. She had very, very, very milky white skin. So she didn't look traditionally dark complected, olive skinned Italian, but she was born on the boat and she just had a little kookiness to her, which, was kind of fun when you're a kid. But we always thought, well, my sister must have got some of that. And my sister has since, just being forthright, she definitely, I think, had some mental health things. Mm-hmm. And I always spotted it. I don't think her family really spotted it, but it's really come to roost now. And she's really having some struggles and with her mental health. So that's unfortunate and, kind of heartbreaking. But so again, we were never alike. We were never the same. I mean, she was gone by the time I was 5, and she was never super warm. I mean, my mom was definitely more warm in nature, as I guess I was to some degree. That's been beaten out of me since, whereas my dad was a little more shoot from the hip and, and funny. And my sister was a little more like him in that regard. I do have to, and I don't know where you put this, but because I know you're from Minnesota and you have to share this anecdote. It may or may not be anything meaningful to you. You're a fellow Midwesterner.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge music buff. And I don't have many vices, but music has always been a vice. I play some music. It's a good outlet, but I'm just a big music fan. And I am a huge fan of the band The Replacements, which is from your neck of the woods. I don't know if you know them, and I hope you don't think less of me. But
that's great.
They were a hot mess. But it's just ironic, I find a lot of perhaps catharsis, and I've just always been a music lover, a big lyrics guy, like good lyrics. But my favorite album of all time, long before I ever made discovery of this, was an album of theirs called Pleased to Meet Me. And if you look on the cover of that album, you can look up the album artwork. It's, kind of a raggedy street urchin hand shaking hands with somebody with a gold watch and gold ring and cufflinks. And, so it's kind of like this middle ground of being somewhere in between. And that idea to me always resonated because in many ways that's how I felt. Because, I grew up in this area that wasn't exactly shiny. I had a perfectly fine upbringing. I mean, nobody's going to cry me a river. I mean, I had a roof over my head and, food on the table. That was never an issue, right? But, it was a little bit of a rough and tumble area, as I referenced in my reading of the descriptor. So that album cover just always, in that line, Pleased to Meet Me, has become even more powerful, obviously, now that I've got more about myself. But the other album title that just blew my mind, that I always thought was the best title for a best of album, was an album of theirs that was called Don't You Know Who I Think I Was? Just always thought it was a funny title, like, you have these grand illusions of who you used to be, or, the place you had in this world. But at the end of the day, it can often be forgotten. Mm-hmm. And Don't You Know Who I Think I Was is just a funny moniker to put on top of what we've all experienced, right? So anyway, so I had a little Minnesota music connection for you, but that is emblematic, I feel, of kind of the feeling that I've often felt, because I kind of came from, pretty grounded background, right? There wasn't anything precious going on where I came from. But, I have spent a lot of time in boardrooms and with pretty successful business people, and, done okay in the business front. But I just always felt kind of in between, like I'm in between those two worlds somehow. And I think this newfound discovery is certainly, reflective of that, because again, I came from parents who were not educated. We lived a very blue collar, middle class existence. Yet my biological family is off the charts, like private planes. And, I think it said, I have an old colleague who became a genetic research. She's a market researcher and a research librarian, and she and her husband were both adopted. And in her semi-retirement, she started a genealogical research company. So I've worked with her as a client since we worked together way back when. And I said, look, I start your company. Let me throw you a little bit of money and tell me what you can find out, because I'm curious about this guy. I don't really have a picture of him. And the profile and the information I got back in him was everything I suspected and knew. I think it was 7,000 apartments said he built. Wow. He would fly around the country. The articles are true. He was a pilot, and he would fly around and scope land out in Arizona and Texas and all over the place, seemingly. So ultimately he was a real estate tycoon. So, it's just kind of funny, because I look at, my dad sold TVs at Sears. That's how I grew up. And he was a great guy, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm proud could be that I'm somewhat of a byproduct of what he stood for. He's the most honest guy I've ever known. And I'd like to think I picked up that. And he was funny. I mean, he was one of those guys that his friends loved him, and people would love him. People either loved him or hate him, because he was so honest that sometimes people don't like that, right? Everybody wants you to be honest until you are. And he could sometimes be brutally honest. So living in between, that, a father who, look at what I've done with my business, and, light years of what he could have ever imagined. And, he'd be blown away, yet not even coming close to what my biological father achieved and attained. Not that that's everything, because I don't think he had a very happy life. His marriage wasn't good, obviously. If he sounded like he was a bit of a philanderer. But I think a good guy, from what I can tell and talking to people. But that notion of being in between is fitting. I guess the other variable that I should add, Lily, we didn't grow up, I wasn't hardcore Catholic, if that's a term, but I grew up Catholic, right? I did go to a Catholic high school, mostly for an attempt at athletics. And that was at my own questioning. I said, hey, can I go to this private school? I think it was like $600 a year. And we'd have that was a real conversation. Like, well, let's talk about this. Mm-hmm. But it was, it was a private Catholic high school in Detroit. I grew up Catholic. I go to a Catholic high school. I ended up going to a Catholic college for undergrad. I got a little scholarship there, and it was a nice little small liberal arts school in Western Michigan. And part of my discovery is I'm half Jewish. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. So there's another little addition to the story. So I decided that if I do write a memoir, I think the title is going to be, because I thought I was Italian, so the memoir is going to be something like From Mamma Mia to Oy vey, Holy Shit, I'm Jewish. So that's the working title right now.
I like it.
Sorry. I hope you don't have to beep out this interview.
No,
sorry,
there are no rules.
Right, well, I've tried to keep in check. Believe me, if I didn't keep it in check, this could be, a disease. You'd have I don't know who even regulates a podcast. Do they? The FCC can't get you. So, I think there was certainly a sense, and it's funny because I have a lot of, since I play a little music here and there, I have a lot of music loving friends. And I do think there's a certain thing that is a uniter, and that is there's often a feeling of, being like not quite fitting. I mean, the thing I'm appreciative is what I do and have done for a living, that background and that being somebody who kind of floats in between has served me well because, I was an athlete, but I hung out with musicians. But I was a good student. And, I never fully went into just wasn't a clique guy. Like I never wanted to be whatever. I just kind of did these different things. And I think there was a little bit of a reflection of like, well, I kind of prided myself in being a little bit of not an outsider because it's not like, but on the outside a little bit. I always felt like I had kind of an objective view looking in. And I think that certainly was a byproduct of growing up in a household where I didn't quite fit. I mean, it was a loving household. I mean, I wasn't made to feel, but my older sister often told me, oh yeah, you're adopted, because that's what mean older sisters do. Now, granted, I was 5 and she was 20 or whatever, that's a little messed up. But at any rate, I never had any suspicions or it never crossed my mind that I'm not my father's child. The first time that came to mind, the first time it ever kind of sparked my synapses was at my wedding shower. It's a room full of ladies and I have to come because I'm the groom to be and my wife's opening presents and I'm there pretending to be helpful and, putting the smile on my face and oohing and on and saying thank you for all the gifts, right? And I remember one of my dad that I grew up with, one of his lady friends who he worked with, made a comment and said, oh my gosh, you look so much like your father. Now, I was in graduate school at the time, and I had just started wearing glasses. I needed it for distance. I'd never worn glasses in my life. My dad, on the other hand, used to say, yeah, wore glasses in the womb. Like he never remembered not wearing glasses. But I just started wearing glasses, and I had a blazer on. I mean, he used to, wear a suit when he worked at Sears. And I remember thinking at the time, no one has ever told me I look like my father. Now, again, that was before my hair thinned a lot. I mean, it was starting to thin a little bit, nothing crazy, and he was a lot taller than I am. But I just remember it struck me in the moment like, oh, nobody's ever said that. It's funny. Nobody's ever said that, right? But I always looked a lot like my mom. And my dad's father had been a coal miner, and I think he ran security for Hudson Motor Car or something back in the day. They're the people who brought you the Gremlin and the Pacer and all the ugliest cars in the world. And he was very stocky, like he was barrel chested and had a little more. I mean, I wasn't quite as stocky as he was, but I thought, well, I must be like my grandfather because he was shorter and stockier. I was probably 5'11", and my dad was, like I said, 6'3". But anyway, never looked like him, never thought about looking like him. But as I got older, and I feel like it's been since we moved to New York, and again, we've been here 19 years, like little things started to like come together to me. And I always used to joke with my wife, oh, well, maybe I'm Mr. J's son, right? Because he was bald, although he had an amazing toupee. But, it was just always a joke. And I don't know why, Lily, that I made that joke all the time. Like, I can't tell you one particular reason, but there was always that joke about, well, maybe I'm Mr. J's son. Ha, ha, ha. Because my mom had a very close relationship with the guy that she worked for. And so fast forward to, I guess, rewind, I should say, to Christmas of 2017. And my wife got me an Ancestry DNA kit for Christmas, ironically. Nothing like finding out you're Jewish for Christmas. So, I got the results back early February. I mean, you've seen this pattern a million times, right? I mean, if somebody gets it for a holiday, I get the results back. And I remember I was in the other room, and I just remember my wife overhearing me say, holy shit. And she's like, what? I'm like, I just got my ancestry results back, and it says I'm half Ashkenazi. And we're like, how? And I did what everybody does, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's wrong. I'll do 23andMe. But, my gut, I started to get that sinking feeling. And I very systematically, my sister, again, takes my sister, she'll just bury stuff, right? So I knew that she wouldn't get around to taking the test. I just know her well enough to know that, she would put, like when my mom died, like getting paperwork done and stuff, she puts her head in the sand. So I reached out to a cousin that I have, again, who's a lot older. I mean, I was always the youngest. I mean, I had no cousins my age or anything like that, because my parents were older when they had me. But I reached out to the cousin and I said, hey, would you be willing to take this test if I send it to you? And she was like, yeah, sure. And sure enough, she doesn't show up as related. So I'm like, all right, because I thought, well, could my dad have been Jewish? Like, and not known it? Could, you do all the what ifs, like you're trying to, trying to figure out the system, right? So when she came back as not related, I thought, okay, I've got a pretty definitive now I know definitively that my dad is not my dad. The craziest part of there are two very, very crazy components, as if it's not all crazy enough, right, Lily? When you do Ancestry, it'll tell you you've got, 900 relatives, or you can search names, right? And I searched my name and only one other person. I had literally almost 1,000 relatives on Ancestry, because it takes you out to eighth and ninth cousins, right? So I had one other person who showed up with my last name, and he showed up as half Jewish. And it's not a Jewish name. So I said, well, maybe this has got to be a clue, right? And he's not far from here. He's in Western Massachusetts. And, because I could see where he's located. And again, I'm in upstate New York. So I sent him a note, and I don't think he responded initially. And then I gave it a few weeks, and I sent him a second note. And again, he wasn't closely related. He was like a sixth cousin or something insane like that. I sent a follow-up note, and I got a very cryptic message back, and it just said, "This is best discussed live." And I think he gave me his number. He said, "Feel free to call me." And so I called the guy, and I said, "Hey, thank you for your willingness to chat." I said, "Sorry to bug you, but, I gave him my story a little bit, that I'm trying to solve this genetic mystery." And the bottom line is we pieced together, he had the exact same discovery that I did. Exact. His mom worked for a Jewish employer. He got 23andMe or Ancestry for Christmas. He found, he had the exact identical discovery. And his mom and dad had the same names. They had the same last names, coincidentally enough, and they married. So, but he solved his mystery quicker. So fast forward to, I suspected it was the family I thought it was, right? But I knew my biological father's wife was still alive. And I thought, do I want to be that guy? She was 93 or something. I thought, I'm not going to reach out. So now this is February of 2018. And I'm like, I don't want to show up. She's 93. I don't want to do anything that's going to cause her to kick off. So I thought, I'm just going to keep this in check. I'm not going to reach out to that family. Plus, I didn't know really how to do it, even though I'd known the brother a little bit. So fast forward a year to the day, almost February to February. And at this point, my son had gone off to college. That was a big year. I found out that my discovery about a month before I turned 50, and my firstborn was going off to college. And, it's like, there was a lot going on. I was working 80-hour weeks. So I finally, at a year, I'm like, you know what? I can't hold out anymore. I got to get an answer. I have to reach out to this family and see if I can, if they're willing to, take a test. Now, fully recognizing that this family is incredibly wealthy, like art collector wealthy, right? If that puts it in context or perspective. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to reach out to him. I knew I could find the brother's number because I had seen it online. I'd found it, and I knew he was living in Florida. So I go to Google the number, literally like a month or a year to the date, and the mom had just died. And I'm like, and I was going to, I was like, the heck, can't worry about her, still being alive. I just got to go forth. And I Googled the number, and she just died like 2 days prior. I'm like, now I really can't reach out to him because, what are wealthy families afraid of? Yeah. Wealthy families are afraid of some guy's going to show up, wanting a little action, right? So now I'm thinking, how do I do this? How do I reach out to them? Because the mom just died. And do I want to do that right on the heels of that? Like, my mind's going a mile a minute. So I decided to wait. And as it turned out, I don't think I waited more than a couple of weeks. It was like I had such momentum going forward, Lily, like I had finally come to terms with the fact that I'm going to try and solve this mystery, that I called. So I called the brother, and sure enough, he answered the phone. It came up on his phone, and he used to call me Robert when I was younger. And he said, Robert, and he remembered me, of course. He knew my mom. He had known my mom his whole life. And we chatted, knew each other enough to be cordial, right? If I had met him 6 times, that's probably a lot. But, we had a central, unity around that little savings and loan that my mom managed for his family. So anyway, we get talking, and he says, well, you're not going to tell me we're brothers, are you? Because I started to build up to it. And I said, well, not 100% sure, but a lot of things would point to it. And I said, do you know anybody else who was on the board of that bank? Because he was on the board with my biological father. I said, do you know anybody else who was on that board who was Jewish? And I think there were others. And he started brainstorming. He said, well, look, I took 23andMe. And I said, well, and maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree because you didn't show up as related to me. And he said, well, he said, let me check my settings. He said, I probably don't have it turned on to public. And suffice it to say, he's not good with technology. As brilliant of a guy is, he's kind of spacey. And he's older. I mean, they're all, these siblings are older. One has since passed away, which we didn't talk about. But bottom line, he texts me at about, I don't know, I talked to him at like 4 o'clock on a Friday, 4 or 5 o'clock. I called him from my office before I came home. And by 9 o'clock that night, I have a text from him saying, we're brothers. So,
Wow.
so that that was kind of big news to them. Now, again, he had a terrible relationship with his father, from what I can understand, because I think my biological father was a bit of a philanderer. He had, someone told me he and his wife's issues were the worst kept secret in town. And I know my mom always thought she was kind of tough. And if you saw pictures of her, you'd go, oof, she kind of looks like a bitch. And my mom was as sweet as they come. And for her to say, but of course you never know what lines he fed her. But anyway, so this brother, he's like, look, I'm probably not the one to talk to about dad, biological father, because I didn't have a good relationship with him. So bottom line, my relationship with that new family, and I should emphasize that, they've kept me at arm's length. Which they did right out of the gate. I mean, they were cordial and they answered health questions. I mean, they didn't just shut it right down. I mean, so a continuum of how great it could have been or how terrible it could have been, it's certainly not at the top, but it's certainly not at the bottom either. And, look, I've tried to be empathetic to the fact that they've got their own lives, they've got families, and as wealthy, and I do mean wealthy, as they all are, they've had their own issues. I mean, you talk about roadmaps. I think even though my biological father and his wife stayed together, it sounds like it was not good. I think across the 3 siblings, there were 5 or 6 divorces, so they didn't have a great roadmap. And honestly, that brother is divorced again, and I think he's probably 74. I don't know. I think he's 18 years older than I am. So 73, maybe going on 74, with him when I was back in Detroit in the fall, and he's just kind of miserable. And there was a niece that I said there was a sister who passed away, sadly. And I could tell there was something hanging over her. And, my instincts were right. But anyway, the niece had even acknowledged that he's just become a little bit of a miserable older guy. But, so he's got everything, but nothing. He's kind of on his own, it seems. Look, I'd like to think I'm pretty much an open book. And it is worth noting that they were kept keeping me at arm's length. And I don't know if it was subconscious or what, but I thought, I'm going to acknowledge this to them. And I told them, because when I did find out before I reached out to them, look, this biological father, again, vastly wealthy. So I did speak with an attorney because I thought I'm not going to be anybody's fool. I don't know that I'm going to do anything, but I'm a guy who likes to at least understand where he stands. And I did reach out to an attorney, and it was very clear to me. I have no, unless he listed me in his will, I have no, legal stature. And that was not a prime driver. That wasn't what I was looking to do, but I did want to at least have the edification of knowing what my situation was. And I acknowledged that to them because I thought I'm going to take this head on, because it's kind of like one of those things where, like, that I know that you know that I know that you know. I'm sure they wondered, who is this guy and what is he going to want? So it was my way of saying, look, I did do this. I looked into it. I got clarity on it, and that's it, right? I thought I'm just going to address it head on. I don't know if that spooked him even more. I don't think it made a difference. I don't think I'd be getting invited over to Sunday dinner or anything like that. It was never going to happen. But there were funny little glimpses, a couple anecdotes that might be shareable. When I was back in Detroit, when I was going to meet them, I had driven back to Michigan. We have a place in the middle of the state, and I was going to go there, and I was going to see my mother-in-law. But I drove out from New York, and I saw one of my oldest and dearest best buddies, who was my best man at my wedding. And I love the guy. He's got a heart of gold, but he's a little crazy. We grew up together. And we went out the night before I had the breakfast meeting with my new siblings, and we probably had a few too many beverages. So admittedly, I did show up to that first meeting, and I'm sure I was a little nervous, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not one who's prone to nerves, but it was a big breakfast meeting. I showed up at that meeting, and I had a little bit of a headache, a little bit of a hangover. I'm not going to kid you. So it probably wasn't the best move, but, that's what we did. Mm-hmm. So I had the breakfast meeting with the new siblings at the same hotel. This, again, the the toniest restaurant in the toniest suburb of Detroit. And I'd been to this hotel for meetings before, but it's like, I remember we had a friend who worked there, and like Pavarotti stayed there, and Barbara Streisand stayed there. One time I had a meeting there, and Van Halen was staying there. It's the place where all the celebrities go. And that's where they wanted to have breakfast. And I do remember telling my wife, I'm like, do they not go to the IHOP? Like, every meeting this family has is at this Tony restaurant. So I went, and we had a nice breakfast, and it was cordial, but it was not a lot of warmth, right? It was kind of, if I'm honest, I think maybe they were sizing me up a little bit, because they didn't know if I wanted anything or what I wanted, but it was a perfectly cordial breakfast. And they shared health information. They shared some anecdotes. The sister, who again, sadly passed away not long after that, told me, because I had written her some emails, and she said, you write just like, I won't call him by name, but just like our father, your writing style. And freaky thing is they've since sent me pictures of this guy. I knew him when he was an older guy. I mean, he was probably close to 70 when I was in my early 20s. I think I figured he was 44 actually when I was born. And he had a toupee. So, I'm looking at the guy like, okay, well, they've sent me pictures of him. I look more like him than anybody in that family. I just wasn't looking for it when I was young, but I've seen pictures of him in his youth, like he was in World War II. And there are some pictures that are absolute goosebump pictures. Like he had to have, I'm going way back to your earlier question, Lily. He had to have suspected, right? I mean, he knew where he had been. And there were photographs where we looked very much alike. And now, as I'm in my early 50s, well, I guess now mid 50s, they've sent me pictures. Actually, the niece did, of the sister who passed away, the daughter of the sister who passed away. She had sent me some photographs, and it was absolutely goosebump stuff. You look at it and it's like, oh my God. I mean, I look a lot like my mom, but I looked a lot like him. So bigger frame. They're all kind of diminutive. I feel like I kind of tower over them. They're like, I don't know, 5'5", 5'6", and I'm not a giant, but they're littler people than I am. And he was shorter for sure.
Have you had any change in your life now that you know you're 50% Ashkenazi Jew?
Yeah. Well, I mean, needless to say, the guy who went to high school with a bunch of Catholic guys and college with a bunch of Catholic buddies, that's, I mean, look, I sucked at one religion. I don't know how I'm going to do it two. What do you do with that? Right. I mean, I did, one of my knucklehead friends, without any note or anything, one day a package arrived at the front door, and it was this big giant book. I think I should have looked at it before we had the call. I think it was called The Newish Jewish Handbook. It was basically anything you'd want to know. And honestly, I have no reason not to. I mean, there's, but my wife and I always joke, my kids are great. And not just as a proud dad, I have a daughter who's in college and a son who's in his first job working in Manhattan. He's about a year and a half out of college. And, I look at them and how they've turned out, and all the variables and all the what ifs and all the stuff you ask yourself. And I look and go, you know what, something worked out right through the nurture, through the nature, however the marbles fall. You think about all the gazillion variables and marbles that can fall in our makeup between nature and nurture. And, I mean, did have a friend. And again, I'm sorry, Lily, if I use bad language on this. If you need to beat me out, I speak the truth and tell you what he said. And again, please forgive me if it sounds crass, but there was an article I found, because, think about what I said I do. I'm a market researcher. I dig into stuff. So it's like Dante's Inferno, having a guy who asks questions for a living make a discovery like this, because your mind's like, oh my God, I got to find out. I got to learn. And you feel like a stalker, which I know I've heard other people say, but you start looking into stuff. And I told you, I wanted to understand my father's background and stuff, but I started Googling stuff, and I found an article about the sister, again, the sister who I only met twice, but the newfound sister. And I know she worked for Rolling Stone magazine at one point, very fashionable, very elegant, I think very much a scenester. She lived in LA. I think she lived in New York. It was nothing like the town that I grew up in that I referenced to you, right? But I found an article, and it was about, she had made the best dressed Detroiters list, which is kind of fun, which is nice. That's a nice thing, right? But I sent it to a buddy of mine, and I said, just think, I said, had I been raised outside of town and, had access to that mentorship and that wealth, I said, maybe I'd be a best dressed somebody. And if you met me, Lily, you would never suspect that. And Monty sent back a note, and all it said, and again, I'm sorry, please forgive me, but all his note said was, imagine what a douchebag you'd have been if you were raised like that. And my friends, as much as they bust on me, that's maybe it's the classic thing that you find gallows humor in it all, right? Because there's certainly heartache that comes with it, right? I don't think I'm telling anybody they don't know. But to answer your question about having, found out Jewish, I've not pursued that faith or anything, but I do believe, I always try and think about what have I learned from this and what good can I take from it. And, certainly the kind of stuff I think about my kids and the stuff you always try and espouse, right? Appreciate the fact that you're here because there's a million variables that could have gotten in the way that you're not here, right? So, it may have been an affair, it may have been an ongoing relationship, whatever my mom's relationship was with my biological father, which, again, I don't have the luxury or the benefit of being able to ask because everybody's gone. My dad, my mom, my biological father. But whatever those variables were that came together, thank God they did, because otherwise I'm not here, my kids aren't here. It's like, it's pretty profound stuff when you start doing the what ifs, right? Mm-hmm. So just a certain level of appreciation. And I think like I said, I've always felt like somebody who's in between the athletes and the musicians, the smart kids and the not smart kids, or I just always felt like I was somebody who could, which may have led me to the profession that I'm in, because you pick a weird subgroup or group of people, and I've probably had a conversation with them or led a discussion group or a focus group. And to me, that's always fascinating to learn from different cultures and tribes and stuff like that. So I do think finding that out somehow is fitting because I kind of like being in between, and now I clearly am in between, and I think it's really taught me to, really appreciate the moment, because even though it's, our wiring and our genetics and all that stuff is so integral, as is the nurturing led to us. But what I've tried to do, like somewhat the 7 stages of grief, I think, which has been certainly said many times before, so I became enamored with it early on and wanted to learn as much as I could. But what I've constantly tried to remind myself, and my wife is, God bless her, she's an angel, is to live in the moment, right? And to just appreciate the here and now. I mean, there's stuff that led up to it, and there's stuff that could be down the line, worried about kids and jobs and marriages, or whatever, is coming. But it's that importance of recognizing that, look, whatever got to us to this point, it's very easy to squander that by over focusing on what could have been, what should have been. Mm-hmm. I could have been ungodly wealthy. Well, okay. Good enough, right? Mm-hmm. There's all these things that you can certainly hem and haw over. And I think, if anything, this has accentuated my hope to always, at least, through the encouragement of my loved ones, be present, be in the moment, appreciate the here and now, what's right in front of you, and don't get too hung up on all the muck that may have led to being to this point. Yeah, if someone wants to reach out to me, again, I may not be heading out of the country for a little bit, so I might be slow in responding. But my email address, it's probably the best way. It's bobmason68. So BOBMASON, the number 68 @gmail.
Well, I hope you get to go somewhere warm, work or pleasure.
Well, my daughter skates for what is effectively a Team USA team. It's like a synchronized skating team, which nobody knows what that is. It's take synchronized swimming and put it on ice, and that gives you what it is. It's not an Olympic sport, but they've been trying to make it. It'll never become an Olympic sport, probably. But bottom line, team is skating in Rouen, France, next week. So we're going to go there for a little bit and kind of travel around Normandy. I used to go to Paris on business a lot, and never been to that part of the country. So, and our son's going to come join us. So we're really looking forward to it. So,
that is
I'll
cool.
respond. Yeah, I know. We're fired up. We last year she was in Salzburg in mid-January, and then Milan in mid-February. And she's a student. I mean, she's missing weeks of class, college. My wife and I went over and just stayed. I mean, it was like a bucket list, like once in a lifetime. So we stayed over there for a month and hit everywhere in between. And, I think we were gone 31 nights or something like that. And
Oh
she's
my
still talking to
gosh.
me. People were speculating if she'd be sitting on the same side of the ice rink by the time we saw everybody again in Milan, and it worked out okay.
Thank you so much for sharing your story today and spending the time to share with me. I really appreciate it.
You are very, very welcome, Lily. Thank you. This is a nice opportunity to be able to do it, and I hope it brings folks some catharsis, and we didn't throw too much at them today.
These stories are here for us to identify with. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, email npestories@gmail.com. You do not have to give any identifying information. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, I'd like to hear from you. Subscribe to this podcast to hear more. Come heal with us.